હવે આવશે.
યા દેવી સર્વભૂતેષુ વિદ્યારૂપેણ સંસ્થિતા નમસ્તસ્યૈ 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 નમો નમઃ. નમસ્કાર વિદ્યાર્થી મિત્રો. ડૉક્ટર બાબા સાહેબ આંબેડકર ઓપન યુનિવર્સિટી દ્વારા સંચાલિત સેટેલાઇટ ઓપન એન્ડ ડિસ્ટન્સ લર્નિંગ પરામર્શન કાર્યક્રમમાં આપ સૌનું ફરી એક વખત હાર્દિક સ્વાગત છે. વિદ્યાર્થી મિત્રો, આપ જાણો છો તેમ આપણે જુદા જુદા વિષયોને અંતર્ગત સેટેલાઇટ પ્રોગ્રામ યોજીએ છીએ. આજે આપણે એક નવા જ વિષયની સાથે અહીંયા મળ્યા છીએ. આજનો આપણો ચર્ચાનો વિષય છે જેન્ડર ઇક્વિટી ઇન ડિસ્ટન્સ એજ્યુકેશન. આ વિષય એટલા માટે આપણે પસંદ કર્યો છે કે આપણે સ્ત્રી શિક્ષણ અને જે સ્ત્રીઓ આપણી પાસે ડિસ્ટન્સ એજ્યુકેશનમાં અત્યારે અવેલેબલ છે એઓને વુમન્સ ડેવલપમેન્ટ સેલ અંતર્ગત આપણે વધારે શિક્ષિત કરી શકીએ. આ આપણો જે પ્રોગ્રામ છે એના માટે આપણે ચર્ચા માટે અહીં મળ્યા છીએ. ત્યારે આપણી સાથે વિષય નિષ્ણાત તરીકે 3 મહાનુભાવો અહીં ઉપસ્થિત છે. હું એઓને સૌથી પહેલાં સ્ટુડિયોમાં આવકારું છું અને હું એમનો પરિચય આપને આપી દઉં. સૌથી પહેલાં મારી સાથે બેઠા છે તે શ્રી A.K. સિંઘ સર, કુલપતિ શ્રી ડૉક્ટર બાબા સાહેબ આંબેડકર ઓપન યુનિવર્સિટી. એમની સાથે છે ડૉક્ટર ડેવિડ સેડકર, પ્રોફેસર, અમેરિકન યુનિવર્સિટી, વોશિંગ્ટન DC. એઓ અહીં આપણી માટે એટલે કે વુમન્સ ડેવલપમેન્ટ સેલ અંતર્ગત આપણને ડિસ્ટન્સ એજ્યુકેશનમાં પરામર્શન આપવા માટે અહીં પધાર્યા છે. હું એઓને પણ અહીં આવકારું છું અને એમની સાથે છે સુશ્રી તસ્નીમ કાલસેકર. હું એઓને પણ અહીં આવકારું છું. એઓ અમેરિકન સેન્ટર મુંબઈથી અહીં પધાર્યા છે. હું તમામ મહાનુભાવોને અહીં આવકારું છું અને સિંઘ સરને વિનંતી કરું કે આજના કાર્યક્રમની વિધિવત શરૂઆત કરે. સિંઘ સર.
Dear friends and learners, on the occasion of particular talk on equity in distance education, I welcome Professor Setkar in particular and Tasneem Kalsekar, who represents the American Center, Bombay. As all of you would know that gender equity is an important issue in all the fields, particularly in education and democracy, because if society has to progress in the lines of democracy, it is necessary that the society as such, which should be say about 50% of women, should be equally empowered. And if they are empowered, then they can participate in the different activities of society and lead to a better society as well. How can this be done? How can we strategize our interventions in this particular process? These are a few very important questions for us, particularly in India, where if we go by a survey, then in India, in higher education, particularly in secondary education, the ratio between boys and girls is say about 74 girls and 100 boys, which is not very satisfactory. In fact, in comparison to the neighboring countries like Nepal and Pakistan and other places, it is a few points lower than even those countries. But we in our university have taken a kind of lead by introducing 2 courses. One is certificate course in women empowerment, another certificate course in development of women and learning as well. For these 2 courses, we have the distance learning mode, wherein we supply the materials to students and counseling is also done. But today we have a kind of unique opportunity because we have a scholar of eminence on equity in distance education with us, which I would personally say that distance education or education things are slightly different in terms of counseling, otherwise scenario remains the same. How to achieve this? These courses would serve their purposes, but we would have a kind of perspective which would be new for all of us, and Professor Setkar would certainly think in terms of comparative study of what he has seen in the West, and during his travel to the other part of the country, how would he make some suggestions in that we will have to implement. Uh, I think best course for me would be to have the introduction first of Professor Satker, and that would be followed by his talk and some interaction towards the end of the talk. For the introduction, I would invite Tasneem Kelsekar, who is Cultural Affairs Specialist at the American Center, and it's because of her efforts that Professor Setkar's visit and this particular talk have been made possible. So I would take this occasion to thank the American Center and Tasneem Kelsekar in particular, and would request her to introduce Professor Setkar. Please.
Hello friends, it's my pleasure to be here today, and an honor to be asked to introduce Dr. David Satker, our guest speaker for today's program. Dr. David Satker is a professor at American University in Washington, D.C., and along with his late wife, Myra Satker, gained a national reputation for work in confronting gender bias and sexual harassment. He has directed more than a dozen federal education grants, authored 5 books, and more than 75 articles in journals such as Phi Delta Kappan, Harvard Educational Review, and Psychology Today. His research and writing document sex bias from the classroom to the boardroom. The Satker's work has been reported in hundreds of newspapers and magazines in the USA. They appeared on local and national television and radio shows such as The Today Show, Good Morning America, The Oprah Winfrey Show, and many more. It's my pleasure to have Dr. Satker with us here today, and I'll request him to present his presentation on gender equity in education. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm pleased to be here, and I thank you for listening. And what I'd like to do in the time we have together is really take you on a trip. The trip would be the life that I've had as a researcher and as a teacher and a writer over the last 35 years. But I promise it won't take 35 years for you to take this trip. It'll probably take closer to 35 minutes. It all began in the early 1970s when my late wife Myra and I were both doctoral students at a university in the States. It was very unusual back then to have a married couple both being full-time students at a university, getting their doctorates together. This would be unusual today. It was really strange then. But it turned out to be an amazing opportunity, an opportunity to see something we often miss. Myra and I would go to class together. I'll take you along to school with us. And we would sit in the room, and the professor would be teaching. And perhaps I'd have something I'd want to say. So I'd raise my hand. And the professor would call on me, and I'd answer, and the professor would say, "Good job." Myra was more shy. She would raise her hand a lot slower. And when it was finally up, sometimes the professor would call on her, and sometimes the professor would not. And when she did get a chance to speak, the professor would say, "Okay." I was becoming a star, very popular in class. Myra had a hard time even having her voice heard. And when we went home after class, she would talk about how it felt not to have a voice in class. We would also write. We wrote articles, we wrote it together, and they were published. Co-authors, David and Myra Satker. But when people talked about our articles, what they talked about was David's article. And Myra, as you might suspect, became sad and despondent and frustrated. So she had an opportunity to write a column in the school newspaper, and she took it. Her column, her editorial, was about how it felt to be in a program, a graduate program, as a woman who was invisible. The invisible female student. And as luck would have it, one of the people who read that editorial was actually a publisher for a major book company. And he said, "That's an interesting topic for a book. Would you like to write a book?" And Myra said, "Sure." So the first book in the United States ever written about what happens to girls in school was written by Myra when she was in graduate school. It was called Sexism in School and Society. And it was written and published in 1973. And we discovered a great American innovation when that book was published. It's called the royalty check. People would buy the book, and Myra would get a royalty check. But I have to tell you, the royalty checks were not very big. And when we asked the publisher to find out why, imagine our sadness when the publisher realized that many people in 1973 did not know the meaning of the word sexism. Myra's book, Sexism in School and Society, was not making sense because the word sexism did not exist in the English language until 1970. Amazing. Hundreds of years, thousands of years of gender bias, and the word sexism was never created. We had a word for bias based on race, based on skin color. It was called racism. But sexism was brand new. And you have to wonder why a bias, a form of discrimination based on your gender, did not have a word until 36 years ago. Well, that event, what happened to Myra and I when we went to class, became really life-shaping. We wondered, was what's happening to us in this graduate program, me being recognized, me having a voice, Myra not, was that true for everybody? And we began researching across America's schools, elementary or primary schools and secondary schools. We received funds and hired raters, observers, to visit over 100 classrooms in 5 states in the U.S. and observe how teachers were teaching boys and girls differently. And we discovered some amazing results. Sitting in the same classroom, listening to the same instructor, in the same school, boys and girls were getting 2 different educations. Boys were speaking out, talking out, even acting out, and causing misbehavior. Girls, on the other hand, were sitting there nice and quietly, smiling, comfortable. The teacher liked them. They liked school. Their grades were really good, often better than the boys' grades. So it looked as though boys were a problem and girls were doing just fine. Until you look closer. When you look closer, you realize there's not only the official curriculum of school, where children learn math and reading and writing, but there's also an unofficial curriculum, one that we call the hidden curriculum. Those are the secret lessons that boys and girls learn. In school, boys learn to speak up, even if they get into trouble. Girls learn to quiet down. Of course, that'll get them a good grade. As you go through school, boys get more bravado, more confidence. Girls become quieter, losing their voice. So when they graduate school, girls are proud of their good grades, but they paid a terrible price for those grades. The price they paid? Silence, losing their voice, and maybe losing their confidence. Boys, on the other hand, feel entitled, feel as though the world is their oyster, and they nearly have to pick out pearls. They do have a voice. Now, is this true in India? Is this true that boys develop strength in a voice, girls do not? Well, I've only been here a week, and I've met with teachers in several cities, and I've looked at some classes. And I'd say in many ways, I think it certainly is the case in India, and I hope that people begin researching this in Indian schools, because the gender problem in India is more severe and more profound than it ever was in the United States. So to me, as a visitor of India, I see a rich country. I see an old civilization. I see a country with a growing democracy, and yet I see that country walking into the 21st century with one hand tied behind its back. And that hand is the hand of half the population that's female, and the other hand is doing better, but it's being brought down by poverty. So I see India moving forward, but I know in my heart that if we could free up both hands, if we can take care of poverty, and if we could give women a voice, that India could move forward quicker, and that all the people of India could benefit. I truly believe that the universe provides everything people need if they know how to ask for it. So when I look at Indian schools, let me just tell you a few things I saw my first week, and then we'll have a little quiz that I'll share with you about how males and females communicate differently, and we'll take a look at the gender gap in U.S. society and Indian society. Here are some things I see right away when I visit schools. I see the girls in one part of the class and the boys in another part. Two worlds separate. When I work with faculty, with adults, I see the same thing. The men sit somewhere, one place, the women sit in another place. While that sounds natural, if done by race, it would sound very unnatural. If I said, all people with dark skin sit over here, and all people with light skin sit over here, that would seem racist, unfair, and it would have really no educational reason for that. So people don't separate by race. But guess what? The same exact thing applies to gender. If you say for no special reason that we expect females to be over here and males to be over here, then you separate your society. You segregate your society based on something that has nothing to do with education. What I tell people in the States when I see classes that are gender segregated, and some are, is to integrate the class. Move students around. Get some of those girls to sit with boys. Get boys to sit with girls. Get people to change their seats. Because if you don't, this is what happens. Teachers will go to where the boys are sitting. Boys are more active, more vocal, and also more mischievous. They get into trouble more. So the teacher moves to where the boys are sitting. The girls are left on their own. And so the girls sit quietly, ask for very little, and receive less of the most important thing in any classroom, which is the teacher's time and attention. Boys sitting together draw the teacher as if by a magnet, as though they were a magnet, and the teacher is pulled to them, and the girls get left out. So the first thing we do is integrate classes. Another thing I do with teachers, and I've been doing it this week in India, is explaining that when you ask a question, it may not be the best or the only approach to call on the first person to raise the hand. Because the first person to raise the hand or to call out is often a male. I ask teachers to wait till 5 hands are up or 10 hands are up and then call on a student, to alternate between male and female so that everybody gets a turn, to speak to the quiet students and explain to them that you're going to call on them. You can even tell them the question you're going to ask them. To set the tone in the class that everybody speaks. One of the most important lessons a teacher can teach children is that in this culture, as in any culture, adults, people who grow up, children who grow up and don't have a voice are less likely to be heard in their own family, are more likely to be abused, and are less likely to get salary raises or promotions in the workplace. One of the things teachers need to teach children, and especially the quiet children, who very often are girls, is to learn how to speak and not be so shy that this weapon, this tool, this gift of voice is lost. Boys have another lesson. It's not the throat, it's the ear. Many boys need to learn how to listen more carefully, at least in the States. I was at a school today, and I would ask questions, and the boys would raise their hand. I would tell the boys, they're all sitting in one section of the room, how are you doing? Tell me. And they would yell, okay, or yes. And I'd go over to the girls and I'd say, how are you doing? There's silence, nothing. And I have to work with them just to say yes. That tells me that India's schools have homework to do. Homework in giving half its population a voice. You know, the nations move forward that best utilize the human potential, the intellect of their citizens. India is gifted with very bright people who have offered the world a great many insights and skills. It can't afford to go out into the 21st century without half its population. So I give teachers really ideas, strategies, practical ideas for how to pull out both students. They could write every student's name on a little card and just flip the cards and call on students. Forget about just calling on the students who speak, who want to speak. A teacher's role is to be intentional, to be thoughtful, and to be a teacher for all the students. So that's much of what I've seen in American schools, and I see the same thing, maybe even more severe in Indian schools. And the gender issues in Indian society, where the status of men and women are so unequal, I think is reinforced in unequal classrooms. So I ask teachers and educators to create fairer classrooms, even if it's difficult. Often what is difficult is what is important to be learning. So that is one part of my visit here, talking to schools and students and hoping they make a difference. Another part is sharing with educators and with others the lessons we've learned in the States about looking for gender bias in how men and women talk in the workplace or in public. And so what I've done is I brought with me 10 questions, a gender communications quiz. And if you'd like to take the quiz with us, that would be terrific. We are going to take a quiz on how men and women talk differently in public settings. And let me give you a few directions. All of these 10 questions were developed on research done in the United States. I met with several of my colleagues in the U.S. who are Indian, and I asked them to look at all the questions I have and to pick out just the 10 that they think apply to India. So what I could say about these questions and the answers I'm going to give you is they're true in the U.S., they may be true in India, and several Indian professors think they probably are true. I'd like you to think if they're true. And by the way, when I gave these questions to groups during this week, sometimes people get them, and sometimes they miss them completely. So let's see how you do. We're going to look at the gender communication quiz. Take these questions along with us and see how you do. All these questions apply to public settings. They looked at factory workers, office workers, people on assembly lines, teachers at meetings, and they analyzed how the males and the females differed in their treatment and in their speech. And we're going to take a look at these. There are 10 questions. We're going to go through all of them together. Each one, as you see, could be marked true or false. What I'd like to do is have you take these questions in your own mind and answer them, and then I'll tell you what the research said in the U.S. and ask you to start looking for this in India. Let's go through another click, and we'll get right to the beginning again, where it says answers on the top. Stop. That's it. Men talk more than women. Do you think that's true, or do you think that's false? Well, when I give this in my workshops in India over the last week, I have to tell you, most people say that's false. Women talk much more than men. And at the meetings, most people said that. And I don't know if they were thinking about at home, or if they were thinking about someone in particular, a woman they know who talks a lot. But the answer, according to U.S. research, and the answer according very often to my ears and eyes, is true. Men talk far more than women. In the U.S., they would do experiments where women and men would talk, and they would use a clock to time it. Let me tell you about one experiment very quickly. They showed men and women paintings, and one at a time they asked them to describe the painting into a tape recorder. How long do you think the average man took to describe a painting? How long do you think the average woman took? For the average woman, it was 2.5 minutes. For the average man, it was 13. Men talk far more than women. At meetings, in deliberations, and at work, men talk for longer periods of time. Now, your eyes and your ears may not see this. You may be blind to this because culture blinds us. We cannot see and tease out objective facts from biased culture. And very often the culture, and let me tell you a little anecdote. This is a fun story. My late wife and I did a lot of television shows in America when our research first came out. And we thought when we went to the shows, how can we do this well? Or, thinking of it another way, how can we avoid making any big mistake? So we thought, Well, we're going to tell them that boys talk more than girls, that men talk more than women. If I go in and I'm talking at the interview and Myra is quiet, people will say, he didn't learn anything from his research. Talk, 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 talk. If Myra talked all the time, people would say, what are they saying? They're saying that boys talk more, men talk more, and this woman doesn't shut up. So what we had to do was take turns. Myra would answer the first question, I would answer the second question. Myra would answer the third question, I would answer the fourth question. We would work to make sure we're equitable. So on our first show, we were on for 5 minutes. We recorded at home the show. We played it back, and with a clock, we timed it. How long does Myra take? How long do I take? And it turned out that Myra and I spoke almost perfectly equitably. There was only 9 seconds difference in 5 minutes. What do you think most people said who saw that show? Why did Myra talk so much? Because when it's perfectly equitable, to eyes comfortable with men talking most of the time, it looks as though the woman's talking too much. That's why we need to find objective tools and not depend on our biased eyes. Let's take a look at the second question. This one says, men are more likely to interrupt women than they are to interrupt men. Now, in your own mind, tell me if you think this is true or false. You have 5 seconds. The answer is true. Men interrupt women much more than they interrupt other men. That's one way they get to talk more. They interrupt people. But if you look closer at the research, you even realize that men and women interrupt differently. When a man interrupts someone who's talking, he redirects the conversation. He says things like, I don't agree. Or wait a second, I have a better story. Or, no. Or my friend. He'll come up and try to kind of take control. When a woman interrupts, she's more likely to build on the speaker, to feed into the speaker, and to agree with the speaker. She'll say, oh, yes, yes, oh, that happened to me. I have a friend like that. So even the nature of the interruption is different. How are you doing so far? 2 questions. Did you get them both right? Are you 50-50? Do you want some more to improve your score? Let's take a look at 3. Question 3 reads, men not only control the content of conversations, they also work harder in keeping conversations going. This one's a little more difficult because there's 2 parts. Men control conversations, and they work harder at keeping them going. What do you think? 5 seconds.
First part is true, second part wrong.
We have a winner right here on the panel. The answer is false, because the first part is true. Men do control the content of conversations. But the second part is false. Women work harder asking questions and keeping conversations going. Now again, I'm not talking about what goes on at home with controlling conversations, but I bet even at home women are keeping them going. But in public settings, this is what we found in the States. Do you believe this is true in India? All I ask you to do is take a look and do it without the cultural glasses. Let's look at 4. Question 4 says, when people hear generic words such as mankind and he, they respond inclusively, indicating that the word applies to both sexes. Do you think that's true or false? Do you think words like mankind, people image applying to both men and women, or do you think that's false?
False.
We have the answer, which is false. When people hear words such as mankind and he, at one level they know it's supposed to include everybody, but in their mind they see men. I'll give you one quick example. People in their 30s were asked to just sketch out a book cover. One group was told the title of the book is Urban Man. Sketch out a cover idea for us. Another group was told the title of the book is Urban Life. Sketch out a cover. I think you know where I'm going. The group that had the directions to draw a cover for Urban Man, at some level they knew that Urban Man was kind of a broad term, but their covers had only Urban Men. The group that was told to draw a cover for Urban Life had men and women and children. Words are very careful. I ask teachers and I also ask employers to think carefully about the words they use because they mean a lot. Try to use words that don't have one gender exclusively in them. Let's take a look at the next question. Question number 5, I guess. Male students receive more reprimands and criticisms than female students. Now we're looking at a classroom, and we see that the answer is true, and I'm going to have to reprimand someone for that. Males are punished more publicly and more harshly than females. By the way, males have a stereotype too. Being troublemakers, they have a burden too, making most of the money in the family. And as India moves towards looking at gender issues, they will come to realize what America is realizing, that there are at least 2 genders, and that when you open opportunities for women, you actually open opportunities for men too. Men who now can be parents and active parents at home. Men who maybe don't have to take the full burden of earning a salary to support a family, but could partner with a woman. Men who don't have to hide and close their emotions. Men who don't have to die years earlier than women because of the stress of their role. Gender bias puts a straitjacket, a box, on both men and women. Let's take a look at the next question. Women use less personal space than men. Do you think that's true? Or do you think that's false? The space around you, the personal space. And the answer? It is true. Women use less personal space. Did you ever go to a lobby or a public place, maybe an airport, a bus terminal, someplace, and you see women and men sitting together? You'll see the women sitting closed up, and you'll see the men stretched out. Men take up more space. Women take less space. What does it mean if you take up more space? Why is it important if males talk more than females? Why does it matter if one gender interrupts more than the other? It matters because those are all signs of silent entitlement, of special privilege, of power that is invisible until you begin talking about it. I hope as we go through the quiz, you'll begin talking about it. Let's take a look at the next question. When a man speaks, he is listened to more carefully than a female speaker, even when he makes the identical presentation. So a man's voice, a man's work carries more power than a female speaker. Do you believe that's true? Let's take a look. It is true. It's called the devaluation of women, and you find it across society. Let's look at the next question. Women speak in a more tentative style than men. What do you think? Tentative, that means asking questions, sounding less sure of themselves, less likely to give an order. What do you think? True or false?
False.
Let's take a look.
Oh.
You were doing well until then. Women do speak in a more tentative style. A man comes into a room and he says, "It's hot in here." A woman comes into a room and says, "Is it hot in here? Are you hot?" Much more tentative. Let's look at the next question. We're going to look at the next question now. Here we go. Women are more likely to answer questions not addressed to them. Women are more likely to answer questions that are not addressed to them. So someone's asking a question and a woman butts right in and answers it. You think that's true or false? Well, if you picked false, you are correct. Men answer questions not addressed to them. That's why they get to talk so much. Let me give you an example. An Indian man and woman go into an office. They're being interviewed by someone, maybe a school official, and the school official will say, looking at the woman, "How many children do you have?" And her husband would say, "We have 3 children. 10, 12, and 14. The names are..." Men do that much more than women. We have one more question. I hope your score is pretty good. The last question reads, there is widespread sex segregation in schools, and it hinders effective communication and effective learning. I think that's kind of what it is.
It's not coming out.
There we go. True or false?
True.
I really started the talk with this one, so I'm trying to see if you remember from the first question to the last. And the answer is
It's true.
true. And as I said, when you segregate, teachers end up with the boys in the class, not the girls. How'd you do on your quiz? I hope you did pretty well, but more importantly, I hope the quiz helps you begin looking at gender bias in your own life, starting in your own family, starting in your own school, because when your behaviors at home and your behaviors at work begin looking for equity, you will find a more complete and wholesome life, one in which male and female work together as equals. When they work separately, there's always pressure, there's always oppression. Both the oppressor and the oppressed feel the weight of that. I'd like to end with one quote, if I might. We can do just the first one. And this is a message from me to you. And if we can put it on the screen, well, I could read it too. Never doubt.
Just a minute, sir. It is on screen.
Okay, I think we have it now. There we go. I like this quote, and I hope you do too. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Margaret Mead was a famous anthropologist. I hope you will become part of that small group of thoughtful, committed citizens changing your world. And I appreciate your hospitality in my trips throughout your country. And I've learned a lot, and I hope I'm teaching some people as well. Thank you.
I thank Professor Satker particularly for coming out of the jargon of what we know today as feminism and yet working for a cause that's on which the fate of humanity rests, particularly in a democratic world. What one would appreciate in the course of his talk is that he is relating this sexism in our classrooms, in education system, with what one can say gender apartheid, and it is as serious as that. In our situation, we often say that we consider women as goddesses, but we must allow these goddesses to speak. We must allow them to have the proper space in society, in the different spheres of a society wherever they live. You would have also noticed that whatever he has said is very pragmatic, very practical, and very practicable also, particularly in our classrooms and so on. And he was in a very mild way hitting nails where it really matters. And I remember when I was a student at St. John's for my MA, one of our professors used to say that when he joined, then there would be one girl standing outside the classroom with folded hands with couple of books in them, and then all boys would be inside. She would wait for the professor, and when the professor would go in, then she would enter the class rather. He said that now the situation has come, and hopefully for better, that after some time boys would stand like that girl, and the girls would be inside and the boys would wait for the teacher so that they can go inside. That's not the situation. That was in very lighter tone, but the fact is that both should have equal space, equitable opportunities in social, economic, cultural development. This particular trip and this particular talk would certainly help us in sensitizing our students on this particular thing. In our open university system, by the way, we do not come in direct touch with students. We get in touch with them through our counselors.
Yes.
And most of the counselors happen to be male. So there is in fact greater opportunity of this kind of discrimination, because it is at the study centers, and we supply the study materials, printed study materials, and these cassettes, CDs, and live telecast. Perhaps after this talk, we will have to think of newer ways of sensitizing our students, our counselors, and what in America, one of the professors, he said that in literature they call it Philomela project. She was detongued, so that Philomela's tongue is to be restored, so that the women, whether they are in the university system working as employees or as students, they have tongue to speak. And something that you very rightly said, that boys or the male should make use of their ears more than their tongues. In fact, in Indian civilization and culture, there is a term called bahushrut. A wise person is one who hears more than he talks. So I think the message for them is that men they have spoken enough. They should listen more and digest it, and create opportunities in which women would have equal space. I think we have come a long way from 1792, when Mary Wollstonecraft wrote that vindication of rights of women, because one of the ways to empower women is moving out of the classroom, because this is the best possible space. If she gets discriminated, if women get discriminated in the classroom, how can we think that they would get their equitable space in villages where they are in many ways dependent on men? But in India, what we have, like you rightly said, that our 1 foot is in like a python, this front part is in 21st century, the tail maybe in 15th, 16th. You never know, in different parts. So in villages, what one feels is that at some level there is greater discrimination. At some level, women have more powerful space. They control the things, and we have quite a few matriarchal societies. Say, for instance, in Kerala and Northeast. Though all these things are changing very fast, and we have to learn a lot from your experience and implement it. Perhaps two great democracies of the world have to think of this question together and move towards a mutually enriching experience in this particular direction. I would take this opportunity to thank American Center, in particular, Tasneem
US Department of State
Kalsekar,
on whose invitation Dr. Satkar is here.
And particularly Dr. Satkar, because I never thought that such a talk on a topic like this can be so much free from acrimony, can be so interesting, and can be so practicable for us in particular. Maybe this interaction, this dialogue that has begun today with the USAFE or United States American Center, this would grow, and we would be happier to have more such interactions, because it opens up altogether a new world. Perhaps tomorrow we will have more interaction when we have this seminar and discussion. Here, if you permit, we can thank Professor Satkar and
perhaps he would want to say a last word to our viewers.
He should have the last word.
Who comprise? I mean, we have our viewers, including educators as well as students. So, would you want to say
educators, counselors, students all over the state,
how they can together make our society
some
more
kind
gender
of,
equitable?
because that you should have the last word and the last laugh, both.
Well, I guess it should be a good last word. I think each person, and I think I'm not alone on this, each person is sacred and each person has value. And I think people in education know this in their mind and in their heart. But I think what they need to do is make sure their behaviors reflect that. Counselors, students, and teachers could look at this as an opportunity to grow in their own work. I have found that equitable teachers, equitable counselors, are effective counselors. One of the foundations of being effective in a classroom or in a counseling setting is being fair and equitable with each student and each person. So I encourage you to do this. It is not easy, but it is very worth it. I'm reminded of an anthropologist who said, if fish were anthropologists, the last thing they would discover would be water. Sexism is like a sea that surrounds us, and too often it's the last water that we recognize. So I ask you to begin looking for it, and in a constructive and cooperative way, come up with ways to get rid of sexism and create more equitable educational environments. Thank you.
I thank you again, beyond words, with me, for being so kind and being with us for this particular talk. We will have more enjoyable session tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
વિદ્યાર્થી મિત્રો, સમયની મર્યાદાને ધ્યાનમાં રાખીને આપણો કાર્યક્રમ હોય છે. અહીં સમય આપણો પૂરો થવા આવ્યો છે, તો તમામ મહાનુભાવોનો યુનિવર્સિટી તરફથી આભાર માની લઈએ અને સાથે કાર્યક્રમને અહીંયા પૂરો પણ કરીએ. તો આપની રજા લઈએ છીએ વિદ્યાર્થી મિત્રો. નમસ્કાર.